Welcome back to What the Flick. I'm Matt, that's Alonso. We are film critics. Some of us know our history, at least Alonso probably does. I probably don't know much. But that was a big thing on film Twitter last week. Everybody was up in arms and everybody was arguing every side of whether or not film critics need to know and share their historical knowledge and use that and blah, 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 blah. It all kind of started with the tweet from, who was it? Kristen Lopez said, a lack of film history is seeping into the new crop of film critics. You have no idea how far I roll my eyes when people review movies with no references to any original source material or past history. Goes on to say, I understand most film sites have younger readers, but then don't trade on said content being historical because we have no idea of its bearing on film history.
Yeah, and I find this, frankly, I can't believe we're having this conversation. To me, it seems so obvious. Of course, you have to know about film history because, everything builds on everything else. It's like somebody said, you wouldn't trust a reporter who didn't know what the New Deal was. You can't talk about what's happening now without talking about the things that got us here. And no one's expecting that you've seen everything or that you know everything.
Right, that's impossible.
Of course, right. Cinema is a global art, and you could spend the entire rest of your life watching nothing but films from Nigeria and Sweden, and it would fill up your day because right. there are Bollywood, there are so many prolific things about it. But there's a basic timeline that I think people need to know, and I think people have to at least have a smattering of the classics, the important artists, and know where things come from. Like I have a friend who's a big fan of Paul Thomas Anderson, and I said, oh, well, have you seen Nashville? And he had not, and so I loaned him my Blu-ray and he loved it, it blew him away. And it's like, Paul Thomas Anderson would be the first person to tell you, oh, you like my films, you should see more Robert Altman. Right. This is where I got stuff from. This is why I cast people from Altman's movies. This is why I was like Altman's shadow director on Prairie Home Companion for insurance purposes. Like there's a connection there. And Altman comes from, things before that. And it goes back all the way to The Silence. And so, to think that everything you're seeing in movies right now is brand new and has no historical context and just sprung out of the side of, Zack Snyder's head like Athena coming out of Zeus. No, that you have to have some idea of where stuff comes from and what people are influenced by.
Yeah, it's by the same token, there's a point at which, I guess the question is at what point do you qualify, right? Because you were talking about earlier, Bollywood films, for instance, or I think about, for instance, you could go back and watch. You could spend years studying the French New Wave,
sure,
right? You could bang out 40 or 50 French New Wave films over the course of a year. But that doesn't mean you know them. That doesn't mean you really have studied them, right? And so there is a point at which you need to, I think it's okay to acknowledge, hey, look, I haven't seen everything, but you want to have some knowledge, right?
Yeah, if you can at least know enough to be like, okay, this is a reference to a movie I haven't seen, but I know that it is one because it's important. Or maybe I haven't seen The Seventh Seal. I have seen The Seventh Seal. What I'm saying, but you would still know that Death playing chess. That's where that comes from. It was not invented for The Last Action Hero or Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey. It's an Ingmar Bergman reference, things like that.
Yeah, I had a friend who was a history major, or I have a friend who was a history major, and I would ask him any history question. His response would be like, it's not all of history that I know.
Yeah.
I'm like, well, but that's a history major, right? So it's similar being a film critic. It's not like you know every movie ever made.
And what kills me about this conversation is happening now is that I'm gonna put on my old man hat. When I grew up obsessed with movies, before there were VCRs and before there was cable, at least in my house, we were pretty late on both of those. So I went to my library and I read books about movies. I circled TV Guide and in the hopes that things were gonna come on. I made my mom drive me across town to the one repertory theater in Atlanta so I could see Citizen Kane when I was 11 because I'd heard it was important, And now you have the internet, you have Filmstruck and YouTube and all this stuff at your fingertips. Your local library has a ton of DVDs that you can go borrow. Your local library also has things like A History of Narrative Film by David Cook or Donald Cook, I forget his name. That was a text I had in several film courses in college. Super handy and useful, gives you a very good history of cinema up until about the mid 70s or so, takes you through the major movements, the major players. And so again, I'm not saying you have to like know every single movie that Howard Hawks ever made, but you should know who Howard Hawks is and maybe a couple of the films he made and why he matters and where he fits into the long history of the cinema as it exists.
Yeah, I think that there's, to the point that Kristen was making about the new crop of film critics, there's, I shudder to think that there's this crop of film critics coming out that says, oh, I don't need to know anything, right? I guess my take on it is, it's not, look, yes, if you like a movie, great. Love that you like a movie, but I want to hear from a writer why. Why do you like it? And if you can't tell me within the concept, within the context of how film works as a language, as an art form, then I don't really think you have much to offer, except that like, oh yeah, I liked it, right?
It's the Chris Farley show,
right? Right. So I want to see, I want to learn something about you and what, and one of the better ways to do that is explain how your understanding of an art form you respond to, similar to music, like I love music, and if you can dance to it, great. But once you really start picking apart how music works and you start understanding how artists are influenced by each other, for instance, the story about how the Blues Brothers started was that Belushi was a metal guy. Like he loved heavy metal and like straight up garage band rock and roll. And Aykroyd basically said to him like, oh, if you like that kind of stuff, you're gonna love blues music, which is where it all comes from, on very broad strokes here. Yeah. And it was like, oh my God. And so he became this blues fanatic to the point that some of it drove them artistically. And most filmmakers will tell you that there are films that films and directors that have inspired them to do things, even if they don't necessarily ever achieve what Hitchcock or Lumet or any of the greats have ever done. Right. At least you see what they're going for, and great. Yeah, and I think it's hard to appreciate what their efforts are if you don't have a similar context.
And if you're a casual film goer and you just want to enjoy movies the way you enjoy movies, that's fine, and no one's saying otherwise. But if you're going to actually write about movies and take on the mantle of having a thing to say about them, then I think you have a responsibility to actually understand the medium that you're talking about, and to know that even before there was Star Wars, there was the Hidden Fortress. Like everything connects to something else, and you should at least be able to have a vague idea of what those dots are.